What is the difference between critical theory and structuralism?
There is no clear distinction of practice that practitioners of both schools of thought would accept. Many structuralists denied being structuralists, and some critical theorists were unaware of the term critical theory. But from the standpoint of a reader, it may help to keep in mind that both structuralism and critical theory provide analyses of society that need not be accepted by the members of society being analyzed. The term critical theory is associated with the Frankfurt School, which developed the 20th century version of scholarly Marxism. The term structuralism refers to a study of mental structures in society. Critical theory seeks to provide analyses that further progressive and egalitarian social goal. Structuralism also uses critical theory. Although the members and followers of the Frankfurt School were not narrowly political, their Marxist legacy tended to point them in certain political directions. While structuralists might have shared certain goals with Marxian critical theorists, their subjects were other social institutions besides government. They also took up Freudian psychology and were instrumental in laying the foundations for a new focus on language and symbols as an important philosophical subject. In some quarters, given the successors or intellectual heirs of structuralism, language and the symbolic order became the only intellectual subject. That is, the structuralists paved the way for intellectual postmodernism, which is also known as post-structuralism.
Who was Jacques Lacan?
Jacques Lacan, 1901 to 1981, was a psychoanalyst who was barred from the International Psychoanalytic Association for his ideas, which nonetheless were very influential. His main works are Écrits, Writings, 1966, The Language of the Self, 1978, and his published seminars. Lacan applied a Saussurean notion of the linguistic order to Freudian psychology. He thought that metaphor and metonymy, substitution of an attribute of a thing for a thing itself, were the main unconscious mechanisms, and that psychotherapy literally works as a form of speech that corrects speech by reinserting into discourse what has been obscured from it by neurosis. Lacan is famous for his claim that the ego consists merely of identifications made imaginatively. He meant that human beings imagine themselves as having certain characteristics at an early age, and that is how the self develops. Speech creates social connection. But language is a formal system in which words derive meanings from other words only.
What is Fodor's language of thought hypothesis?
The language of thought and thinking, as a mental language, is a system of symbols in the brain. Its content are propositional attitudes such as, thinks that, desires that, intends that, believes that, hopes that, and so forth. Each attitude has a distinct computational relation to a representation. Computation is information processing based on syntax. As Fodor puts it, there is no computation without representation. Thus, having a belief is being in a computational relation to a representation, as is having a desire. Every primitive concept in thought has a neural symbol in the brain. The end result of this in behavior is that the representation that is a belief causes an individual to behave as if it were true. Whereas the representation that is a desire causes the individual to behave to make it true.
For example, how is the mind connected to the body?
Most of us know that if we want to raise our right arm and we are not paralyzed, it is the easiest thing in the world to do. We just decide to do it and the arm goes up. But ever since the work of the 17th century philosopher René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, philosophers have argued passionately among themselves about the right way to describe the connection between the mind and the body.
What was Plato's academy?
Sometime between the early 380s and 367 B. CE, Plato founded the academy in Athens, where he lived. Plato's academy provided higher education to sons of the aristocracy. It was different from Isocrates, c. 436 c. 393 BCE, school, which formalized the teachings of the sophists in politics and rhetoric for the practical aim of training lawyers. Plato's students, on the other hand, were taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Aristotle entered the academy when he was 17. And in his early 20s added the subject of rhetoric to the curriculum. Plato's academy was probably co-founded by Theaetetus, 417 to 369 BCE. After whom Plato named a dialogue, and Eudacus, c. 408 c. 347 BCE. Astronomer and mathematician. Lectures were given to seated students who took notes. There were probably never more than 100 students in attendance at a time. And it is not certain that Plato himself lectured there.
What are the qualities/characteristics of Friedrich Nietzsche's Overman?
Nietzsche posited the Overman as a new type of human being who would create values in an age when Christianity was no longer a living religion. Unlike the ideal Christian, the Overman would not be meek or ashamed of his strength. He would love life on earth completely, with no need to believe in heaven.
What is Dasein?
Dasein is Martin Heidegger's term for a human being. Its literal meaning is being there. Heidegger intended by this term to convey that human beings are not simple, self-contained biological beings, but that they are always concerned with things beyond their physical selves. With things in the world, other people, and the future.
Did Plato and Aristotle influence early Christian and medieval philosophy?
Yes, but both early Christian and medieval philosophy were influenced by interpretations of Plato and Aristotle's thought, which neither they nor today's scholars would accept as completely true to the sources. This was because Plato was given a Neoplatonic interpretation, and Aristotle was interpreted through a Christian worldview. Not until the Renaissance did the intellectual complexity and humanism of ancient Greek thinkers begin to fully re-emerge, however. Until Aristotle's texts were rediscovered in the 9th century, Plato was the major influence from antiquity. Although many of his dialogues were lost, and until the Renaissance, all Greek or pagan philosophy took a distant second place to Christian theology and philosophy.
What were Grotius' influential ideas about natural law?
Hugo Grotius, in Dutch, Huig de Groot 1583–1645, modified natural law from a prescription for the common good to a doctrine restraining what individuals were permitted to do in pursing their own separate goods. That is, he changed Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, notion of natural law from a communal idea to an individualistic one. This line of thought was highly influential for the political philosophy developed by both Thomas Hobbes (1588–1679) and John Locke (1632–1704). According to Grotius in the Law of War and Peace, 1626. Natural law could be used to settle religious disputes, as well as international ones. Grotius thought that natural law could be known by observing human nature. He concluded that humans are both sociable and combative, and that every person has rights that limit what others can do. Government is the result of sacrificing some rights so that our lives will improve. Grotius thought that we would be obligated to obey natural law if God did not exist. Although he also thought that God does enforce natural law. Both Hobbes and Locke constructed theories of just and useful government, beginning from foundations of natural law. However, Hobbes emphasized the combative aspects of human nature, whereas Locke emphasized the sociable side.
How was Neoplatonism similar to Christianity?
Just as Christianity promised a better emotional and spiritual world in times of great social and political upheaval, the Neoplatonists offered their followers an intellectual picture of a higher realm that could also console them personally. That is, Neoplatonism was closer to Christianity than to other ancient philosophies because of its emphasis on one creator and the importance placed on the feelings of its followers.
What was William Hamilton's philosophy of the conditioned?
Hamilton called the conditioned something that has been described or classified, and the unconditioned things that are without descriptions or classifications. His philosophy was an attempt to create a balance between the conditioned and the unconditioned. Hamilton wrote that all that is conceivable in thought lies between two extremes, which, as contradictory of each other, cannot both be true, but of which, as mutually contradictory, one must be true. The law of the mind. That the conceivable is in every relation bounded by the inconceivable, I call the law of the conditioned. Hamilton held the theological belief that the infinite is incognizable and inconceivable.
How did the facts of Wollstonecraft's life obscure her work?
Mary Wollstonecraft's life was tumultuous in a way that was shocking to her peers and many later thinkers. Her husband, the philosopher William Godwin, 1756–1836, wrote the memoirs of the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman a year after Mary had died in childbirth at the age of 37. Godwin, the founder of modern anarchism, was vilified by the poet Robert Southey for the want of all feeling in stripping his dead wife naked. And in a satire called The Unsexed Females, a poem, 1798, published by Richard Polbley. Mary Wollstonecraft was born in Spitalfields, London, and her father squandered their money and took over her own small inheritance. He drank excessively and beat Mary's mother. Her sisters, Everina and Eliza, were also to have unhappy marriages. In her teens, Mary became friends with Jane Arden, whose family had intellectual interests, and Fanny Blood, with whom she later started a school in Newington Green, which was known as a dissenting community. Blood married, became ill, and died. The school fell apart, and Wollstonecraft worked as a governess, leaving after a year when she decided to support herself by writing. This was a very daring ambition for a woman at the time, and Wollstonecraft called herself the first of a new genus. In London, she was assisted by the publisher Joseph Johnson. She became part of a circle that included Thomas Paine and William Godwin, and supported herself by translating French and German texts after learning those languages. She had an affair with the married artist Henry Fuseli, who rejected her when his wife refused a platonic ménage à trois. She then wrote Vindication of the Rights of Men, 1790, followed by Vindication of the Rights of Women. 1792, and traveled to France a month before Louis XVI was guillotined. There she fell in love with the adventurer Gilbert Imlay, with whom she had her daughter, Fanny. Imlay rejected Mary, and when she returned to England she twice tried to commit suicide. Eventually, she became romantically attached to Godwin and they married so that their child would be legitimate, though they lived in separate houses. Their daughter, Mary, became Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Fanny committed suicide at the age of 22.
Has Nicolaus Copernicus' theory withstood the test of time?
The Copernican theory that the Earth and other planets revolve around the Sun is still accepted as true today. Although at first Aristotelians and conservative theologians found the Copernican theory outrageous, the educated papal authorities had a deep interest in science and recognized the explanatory power of the Copernican theory. They tried to get Galileo, who was an enthusiastic supporter of the heliocentric theory, to temper his claims so that the Copernican theory would not contradict religion.
Who is Jerry Fodor?
Jerry Allen Fodor, 1935, a philosopher of cognitive science at Rutgers University, is perhaps best known for his modular theory of mind and his concept of the land gauge of thought. Fodor's books include Psychological Explanation, 1968, The Language of Thought, 1975, Representations. Essays on the Foundations of Cognitive Science, 1979, The Modularity of Mind. An essay on faculty psychology, 1983, Psychosemantics, The Problem of Meaning in the Philosophy of Mind, 1987. A Theory of Content and Other Essays, 1990, The Elm and the Expert, Mentalace and its Semantics, 1994. Concepts, Where Cognitive Science Went Wrong, 1998, In Critical Condition, 1998, The Mind Doesn't Work That Way. The Scope and Limits of Computational Psychology, 2000, and Hume Variations, 2003. Fodor also writes about opera for the London Review of Books. His writing style is uniquely witty and peppered with joyful mockery, as well as homespun analogies and references.
What was Franz Brentano's main contribution to empirical psychology?
Brentano's lasting importance lies in his emphasis on the intentionality of conscious states and attitudes. He pointed out that thoughts, beliefs, hopes, desires, and the like which Bertrand Russell 1872 to 1970 was to term propositional attitudes are directed toward some object. For instance, if you are thinking about an apple, then your intentional object is the apple you are thinking about. If you want a new car, it is the car you intend as an object of that desire. Because physical states are not intentional in this way. Intentionality is a basis on which what is mental can be distinguished from what is physical. Brentano identified three different kinds of intending: ideas, judgments, and the phenomena of love and hate. The last, also known as emotions and volitions, are directly related to morality. Although an earlier version of Brentano's doctrine called immanent intentionality suggested that the object intended was in some way literally in the mind, he later explained that although there is always a mental object for consciousness, the object need not literally exist. The point is that one can think of a thing that does not exist. Objects of thought that do exist have strict relations with other objects that exist, whereas those that do not exist lack them.
He wrote in Does Political Theory Still Exist?
It is seldom that there is only one model that determines our thought, men, or cultures. Obsessed at their models are rare, and while they may be more coherent at their strongest, they tend to collapse more violently when, in the end, their concepts are blown up by reality. By the same token, Berlin was not enthusiastic about harmony or agreement in political life. He believed that well-intentioned individuals could hold opposing values, resulting in inevitable moral conflict. These collisions of values are of the essence of what they are and what we are.
Does Gorgia's conclusion that whatever is real cannot be thought make sense?
No, there is a gap in his reasoning. Just because thinking about a thing is no guarantee that the thing exists, does not mean that none of our thoughts are thoughts about what exists.
What was George Santayana's contribution to pragmatism?
Other than the fact that Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, was his teacher and C. I. Lewis, 1883 to 1964, argued against his intuitive theory of knowledge. It is not always clear how Santayana was a pragmatist. The philosophical convention places him within that group, mostly due to time and place and the pragmatist philosophers he interacted with while living in the United States. Still, Santayana's ideas about aesthetics, reason, philosophy itself, and human nature share a common spirit with William James, 1842 to 1910, and John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Santayana's theory of aesthetics was that beauty is the experience of pleasure in the form of an object, rather than the effects on the sense organs of the person experiencing the artwork. He claimed that all preference is basically irrational and that values are based on pleasure. His take on reason emphasized human creativity in science, religion, society, and ordinary life, as well as more obviously in art. Overall, he identified human beings as animals, inhabiting a physical world, oriented toward food, and fearful of danger. Santayana thought that nature was a kind of backdrop within which we have our experience. In The Life of Reason, 1905 to 1906, he described nature as drawn like a sponge, heavy and dripping from the waters of sentience. The nature of nature is thus conditioned by our experience of it. These views characterize his early work. After he left Harvard, Santayana wrote about metaphysics and ontology, emphasizing objective reality as opposed to human experience. But Santayana himself did not acknowledge this change in his subject matter, and in his later writing he claimed to be providing a more comprehensive and rigorous foundation for his earlier theories of art and experience.
What is anarchism?
Anarchism is the political doctrine that human happiness and well-being are best served without powerful political structures. Anarchists seek the decentralization of power into small units, controlled by the people.
How was Jonathan Swift opposed to Enlightenment values?
Jonathan Swift, 1667 to 1745, is considered to have been at heart a sincere Christian who did not believe in the rationality of human nature, but rather thought that whenever order is established, it then begins to disintegrate. In 1709, in a project for the advancement of reason and the reformation of manners, he implored Queen Anne to begin a moral crusade against contemporary vice. However, the great irony about Swift was that his characteristic path to moral reform was through satire and sarcasm. He sent up the established respectability of his age through forays into fiction, as well as the rhetoric of a pamphleteer. Thus, when it became clear that he would not get support for the plight of the poor in Ireland, he and his friends founded the Scriblouse Club for the sake of engaging in activity against the dunces. Swift is most famous for his 1726 satire, Gulliver's Travels. His 1729 a modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people from being a burthen to their parents or country, and for making them beneficial to the public was a shocking criticism of the treatment of the Irish poor, in which he suggested that their babies be substituted for the traditional goose that graced the tables of absentee English landlords.
What are some interesting facts about William James' life?
James was the oldest of 5 children. His brother Henry was the famous novelist, and his sister Alice became well known for her posthumous diaries. James' father, Henry James Sr., was both wealthy and eccentric. The James children were educated in the United States, England, and Europe, and William grew up with a cosmopolitan perspective. James was at first interested in studying art, but then turned to science. In youth he suffered from eye, back, stomach, and skin problems and was diagnosed as neurasthenic. He experienced depression and, at times, prolonged suicidal thoughts. While some of his ailments might be considered psychosomatic today, he did eventually die of heart failure. James began medical studies at Harvard in 1864 and took time off to travel on expeditions to the Amazon and to Germany for cures of various physical complaints. He was awarded his M.D. in 1869. It was his only academic degree, although he never practiced medicine. He married Alice Gibbons in 1878 and spent the remainder of his life teaching at Harvard. In both psychology and, after the early 1880s, philosophy. James' students included such luminaries as President Theodore Roosevelt, author and philosopher George Santayana, civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois, philosopher Ralph Barton Perry, author Gertrude Stein, philosopher and legal scholar Morris Raphael Cohen, Alain Locke, sometimes called the father of the Harlem Renaissance, logician and pragmatist C.I. Lewis, and psychologist and philosopher Mary Calkins.
How did George Berkeley's theory of vision relate to the concept of matter and physical existence?
Berkeley is well known for his theory of vision that contributed so much to modern psychology of perception. However, in that theory he completely repudiated the primary bastion of empiricism, namely, matter. Berkeley departed from both common sense and science in elaborately insisting that matter, the entire physical world based on our best evidence, simply did not exist in the way that the other empiricists Hobbes, Locke and Hume, and later on, John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell assumed that it did. For any serious student of the history of philosophy, Berkeley is either a delightful aberration or an intractable obstacle because of this position.
What were Friedrich Hegel's main ideas?
Hegel's system is difficult to describe because all of its parts are interrelated. And so to describe one aspect of it is to evoke all of the others. It is not clear exactly where an interpreter might begin. Hegel's order of exposition in the progression of his work is not a good guide because the structure of his system has to be presupposed in order to make sense of the progression. In other words, Hegel had his whole system in mind as he wrote about different parts of it. This said, there are several important elements that can be identified as Hegel's premises. Man has a history, but nature does not. All men do not have the same categories of fact. Human thought, develops. Philosophy should give a rational account of religion. Social stability is possible after the French Revolution. Individual autonomy is possible in a unified society. The nature of things is a system, and a system of knowledge must reflect that.
How did Charles Hartshorne's system of the universe work?
All human sensations, according to Hartshorne, are feelings, and nature itself is the totality of all interactions of sentient, creative beings, which exist for all time in God's memory. The entire universe is literally God's body. The most important values which can be sensed and are immortal as events of sensation concern beauty. Beauty can be theoretically understood as a mean between order and disorder and / or simplicity and complexity.
Who was Thomas Aquinas and what made him known as the greatest medieval philosopher?
St. Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, was born in Roccasecca, Italy. He began his religious studies in a Benedictine monastery and studied liberal arts at the University of Naples. He entered the Dominican order of preachers when he was only 20. He studied theology in Paris, attaining his doctorate in 1256, and taught there until 1259. Aquinas then lectured on theology and philosophy at Dominican monasteries near Rome, and then returned to the University of Paris. He taught for a year in Naples in 1272. Aquinas died near his place of birth, while traveling to a church council in Lyons. During his teaching career, which spanned from 1252 to 1273, Aquinas wrote extensively. He lucidly solved long-standing problems in the interpretation of Aristotle, made clear distinctions between Christian theology and philosophy, and demonstrated how the two were compatible on many subtle points.
What were Auguste Comte's sociological ideas?
Comte believed that in all the sciences, there are three historical phases: theological, metaphysical, and scientific or positive. The theological phase contains religious restrictions and belief in the supernatural. The metaphysical phase involves the justification of political rights above authority. In the scientific phase, solutions to social problems can be found. By combining these laws of phases, Comte developed an encyclopedic law, according to which all of the sciences could be ordered into a hierarchy in which sociology was the greatest and included all of the others. Comte wrote, "If it is true that every theory must be based upon observed facts, it is equally true that facts cannot be observed without the guidance of some theories." He thus posited an interconnection between facts and theories, which holds to this day.
What kinds of jobs do philosophers have?
Since about 1940, most professional philosophers have been employed as teachers in colleges and universities. They also advance the discipline of philosophy by publishing books and articles.
Who was Pyrrho of Elis?
Pyrrho, c. 360 to 275, started out as a painter and then became interested in Democritus. c. 460 to 371 BCE, atomism. He traveled with Alexander the Great to the east, where he studied with the gymnosophists in India and the Magi in Persia. He had students but left no written work. When he would refuse to judge whether a chariot headed his way would hit him, his students often had to rescue him at the last second.
Who was Friedrich Engels?
Friedrich Engels, 1820 to 1895, founded Marxism with Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883. In addition to the Communist Manifesto, 1848. They collaborated on the Holy Family, 1844, and the German Ideology, 1845. Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England, 1844. Described the suffering in the lives of workers at that time. Engels also published Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, 1880, and Anti-Düring, 1878. In the Dialectics of Nature, 1883, Engels related historical materialism to natural science and claimed that there were universal laws of nature and thought. Engels' greatest contribution was a presentation of Marx's ideas in more accessible and popular formats and terms. Engels' father was a textile manufacturer, and the young Engels worked at his mill in Manchester, eventually owning it. Engels helped Marx financially throughout his life and also supported his children after Marx died. He edited Marx's Das Kapital after Marx's death.
Why was Bernardo Telesio called the first of the moderns by Francis Bacon?
Bernardo Telesio, 1509 to 1588, studied philosophy, physics, and mathematics at the University of Padua. Receiving his doctorate at the age of 26. His subsequent pedagogical activity consisted of conversations with friends under the patronage of the Carafa family in Naples. He was also sought after by Pope Gregory XIII, 1502 to 1585, who invited him to Rome. Telesio's major work was on the nature of things according to their principles. Telesio's innovation was to propose that knowledge of nature be based on sensory information about matter and the forces of heat and cold. Because of this emphasis on sensory information, Telesio is credited with laying the groundwork for more rigorous ideas about scientific investigation, which would soon follow in the work of Francis Bacon, 1561–1626, and Galileo Galilei, 1564–1642. However, Telesio's own theories about the workings of nature do not greatly depart from Neoplatonic perspectives. According to Telesio, heat, represented by sky, is the source of life and the cause of biological functions. Cold is represented by earth, and it opposes heat. Heat also emanates spirit, which in animals and humans is located in the brain. For the purpose of anticipating and receiving sensory information, man also has an anima superadita, or mind, which is created by God and present in both spirit and body. All beings have a desire or impetus toward self-preservation, which in human beings includes a goal of everlasting life. Who was St.
What is experimental philosophy?
It is a very new philosophical approach that aims to use empirical information to back up the ordinary intuitions to which philosophers refer. People are given philosophical problems or solutions to them and asked if they agree with the philosopher's answer. Experimental philosophy has been applied to philosophy of language, philosophy of action, and intuitions that free will is not compatible with determinism.
What were William James' theories concerning religion and free will?
James thought that whether or not to believe in God, or to believe that we have free will, and that there are objective values, cannot be decided neutrally by an appeal to facts. The facts in such matters are inconclusive, and a neutral intellectual position does not address the importance to us of whether or not God exists, or if we have free will, or whether there are objective values. Because our beliefs in such matters will make a difference in our lives and those of others, we must will to believe that God exists, that we have free will, and that there are objective values. In the case of free will, to motivate ourselves toward actions that are unpleasant, we should think about their positive consequences. James offered an example of this, when one is reluctant to arise from bed on a cold morning. If one thinks about what one will do that day, the necessary physical motion becomes almost automatic.
Was Bacon's life as direct and clear as his ideas?
No. Francis Bacon, 1561–1626, lived a complex life with active political involvement in the affairs of his time. great ambition, and the appearance of deviousness. He was born in London and raised as a gentleman. His father, Nicholas, served Queen Elizabeth I as Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. Francis entered Trinity College, Cambridge, at age 12 and soon met the Queen. At the age of 15, he is said to have learned that he was Queen Elizabeth's illegitimate son from her secret marriage to Robert Dudley, at which Nicholas Bacon had been a witness. When his father died suddenly in 1579, it disturbed Francis' prospects for a substantial inheritance. This initiated a lifetime of debt. He began to study law and took a seat in Parliament in 1584 and again in 1586. He urged the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, a Catholic rival to Elizabeth's throne. Then he met Queen Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, who was to prove useful as his patron for a while. Bacon applied for a succession of high offices that eluded him, although Essex helped him financially. He did get the post of Queen's Counsel in 1596, but it paid no salary. In 1586 he was briefly arrested for debt. He took an active role in investigating treason charges against his friend and patron, Essex, who was executed in 1601. At the age of 45, he married Alice Barnum, who was the 14-year-old daughter of a well-connected alderman. After James I became king, Bacon was knighted. He served the king well and was rewarded with the office of Solicitor, then Attorney General, and finally Lord Chancellor in 1618. He again fell into debt, however. During this time he was accused and convicted of bribery. His sentence was a fine and disgrace. He continued his studies while in retirement and was honored at age 60 with a banquet held by his Rosicrucian and Masonic friends. The famous poet Ben Jonson attended and said of him, "I love the man and do honor his memory above all others." In 1626 Bacon was in London, travelling through the snow with the king's physician. When he got the idea of using snow to preserve meat, they immediately bought a fowl, had it killed, and Bacon stuffed it with snow. He came down with pneumonia and ate the bird, hoping to regain his strength from it, but died nonetheless.
What were Wollstonecraft's main political ideas?
In vindication of the rights of men. 1790, she argued against Irish statesman and political theorist Edmund Burke's 1729 to 1797, conservative attack on the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. Her claim that Burke's endorsement of custom and tradition implied that slavery was acceptable made her famous overnight. Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, in which Wollstonecraft sounded a clarion call for the recognition of women as human beings, was innovative in its progressive thought.
What is Bertrand Russell's theory of types?
Russell began with a puzzle inspired by the German philosopher Gottlob Frey's 1848 to 1925 attempt to reduce mathematics to logic. Is the class of all classes that are not members of themselves, or C, itself a member of itself? This question seems valid, but Russell showed that it leads to contradictions. If C is a member of itself, then it should not be in D, which is the class of classes that are not members of themselves, but if C is a member of itself, it will be in D. But if C is not a member of itself, then it should be in D, and C is a member of itself. Russell's answer was that there is a hierarchy of types, of things that restricts what can be said about them. So we can say that Russell is an analytic philosopher, but not that a group of people are an analytic philosopher.
What topics are addressed in Plato's middle works?
Plato's doctrine of immortality is taken up in the Phaedo, Republic, and Phaedrus. Plato thought that the human soul survives the death of the body. However, the soul's memories of its life are washed clean in the river Lethe. The soul then returns as the soul of another person to live a new life from birth. Also in these works, Plato develops his notion of forms, first introducing them in the Phaedo and going on to define them as eternal, changeless, and immaterial. The relationship between real things to the forms is one of participation. A particular cat that might be your pet, for instance, is a cat because it participates with the form of a cat. While your cat might squint or cough up fur balls, the ideal form cat would not be subject to such irregularities. However, not only neutral and beautiful things have their forms, but everything does. That is, bad cat eyesight and fur balls would also have forms in which they participate. In other words, there is the idea or form of a cat that includes all that makes a cat a cat. And then there is the appearance of your particular pet.
What are these various specializations and subfields of philosophy?
Various specializations of philosophy and their subject matters include ethics, how human beings ought to behave in matters involving human well-being or harm; philosophy of science, answers to questions of what science is, how science progresses, and the nature of scientific truth; social and political philosophy, accounts of how society and government work as institutions, what their purposes should be, how they came into being as institutions and how their problems can be fixed; epistemology, answers to questions about what knowledge is, how we know that something is true, and the relation between sense perception and abstract truths; Metaphysics, the most general questions and answers about the nature of reality, what physical things are, what relations exist between different kinds of things, and the connections between the mind and the world. Philosophy of mind, how the mind works, whether it is dependent on the brain, how it is connected to the body, the nature of memory and personal identity. Aesthetics, the study of art toward an understanding of what beauty is and how artworks are different from natural things and other man-made objects. Ancient philosophy, the birth of Western philosophy from about 800 BCE to 400 CE. It is composed mostly of Greek and Roman thought before Christianity. Medieval philosophy, the development of philosophical thought. From about 400 CE until the Renaissance in the 1300s in Europe, in which Christianity provided the dominant worldview and organizing principle for daily life. Modern philosophy, the foundations of contemporary philosophy from the 1600s through the 1800s. 19th century philosophy, the classical period of modern philosophy, in which Friedrich Hegel, Immanuel Kant, and John Stuart Mill wrote. Analytic philosophy, style of professional philosophy, which is abstract and technical, that developed during the 20th century. Postmodern philosophy, school of thought that, in the second half of the 20th century, consisted of reactions against many of the shared assumptions held by philosophers over the centuries.
What was George Berkeley's new theory of vision?
Berkeley, like René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, sought to account for the perception of distance. Descartes had claimed in his Dioptrics, 1647, that an innate knowledge of geometry enables even those who have never studied geometry to calculate distance by figuring out the height of a triangle formed by light rays from the visible object to each eye. Berkeley built on Irish natural philosopher William Molyneux's 1656 to 1698 claim that distance, as a length from the object to the eye, cannot itself be seen. Berkeley reasoned that since what is seen is a two-dimensional object, its relation to distance is contingent, dependent on sensations in the eyes, and associations in the mind between what has been touched and what is seen. These associations depend on past experience. The overall result of Berkeley's reasoning about how vision works is that visual perception is an active, learned process. He also claimed, against John Locke, 1632 to 1704, that there are no general ideas common to both sight and touch.
How were Friedrich Schelling's views of culture aesthetic?
Schelling believed that history is a drama that will be resolved when the absolute discloses itself. God is an artist, the universe his artwork. The main value of religion lies not in its morality, but in its beauty.
Who was Isaiah Berlin?
Isaiah Berlin, 1909–1997, was renowned for his work on ideals of liberty in democratic societies. He was born in Latvia and educated at Oxford. He was president of Wolfson College, Oxford, from 1966 to 1975. He is famous for his distinction between positive and negative liberty and his criticism of Marxist ideas of history. Berlin was a brilliant and elegant speaker and delivered lectures on the British Broadcasting Corporation, often without notes. Berlin's major works include Historical Inevitability, Two Concepts of Liberty, 1959. Four Essays on Liberty, 1969, Russian Thinkers, 1978, Against the Current, Essays in the History of Ideas. 1979, Personal Impressions, 1980, The Crooked Timber of Humanity. Chapters in the History of Ideas, 1990, and The Sense of Reality, Studies in Ideas and Their History, 1996.
How were Joseph Marie de Maistre ideas similar to Edmund Burke's?
Joseph Marie de Maistre, 1753–1821, was a Roman Catholic political theorist who sought to restore traditional society according to Thomism, the teachings of Thomas Aquinas c. 1225–1274, he viewed the French Revolution as satanic, in his 1796 Considerations on France. However, de Maistre went beyond Burke in his belief that the Catholic Church would triumph over Enlightenment philosophy. In his 1810 essay on the generating principle of political constitutions, he described a fundamental human and God-ordained desire for order and discipline.
What was Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy?
Whitehead believed that it is impossible to have an idea of simple spatial or temporal location. He claimed that in our immediate experience nothing possesses this character of simple location. Instead, Whitehead held that simple location requires a process of constructive abstraction that is made up of considerations of existing volumes extended over one another, such as a nest of baskets, Russian dolls, or pots of different sizes. Every location has an aspect of itself in every other location and thereby mirrors the entire world. It's unlikely that Whitehead meant literally mirrors, so much as he wanted to emphasize that things are not completely self-contained or isolated from other things. Moreover, what we imagine to be objects are actually constructed events and processes. Process, not substance, is the basic unit of the world. The work of philosophy is to explain the relations or connections between scientific and logical descriptions of reality and our everyday experience, of nested volumes. To believe that science directly describes experience is to commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
What was John Stuart Mill's formulation of utilitarianism?
Mill showed how the principle of utility can be used to account for individual action and collective values. As a consequence of individuals seeking their own happiness, the good of society as a personal goal might be a result. Social values such as justice, in Mill's account, do not benefit society as mere abstractions, but only if individuals seek them out in their own lives.
Who was George Santayana?
George Santayana, born Jorge Agustin Nicolas Ruiz de Santayana y Boraz, 1863–1952, was a philosopher, poet, art critic, and author of the international best-selling novel The Last Puritan, 1935, new edition, 1936. His father was Spanish and he was born in Madrid, but his Scottish mother brought him to the United States when he was 9 and enrolled him in the Boston Latin School. In 1889 he received a Ph.D. in philosophy from Harvard, with Josiah Royce, 1855–1916, as his advisor. In 1892 he accepted an instructorship at Harvard and later became professor of philosophy, teaching there for 20 years. Santayana's students included authors Conrad Aiken, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, and Walter Lippmann, as well as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. Santayana retired from Harvard in 1912 and spent the remainder of his life writing and traveling in Europe. His main publications are The Sense of Beauty, 1896, Interpretations of Poetry and Religion, 1900. The Life of Reason, 5 volumes, 1905–1906, Skepticism and Animal Faith, 1923, The Realms of Being. 4 volumes, 1927–1940, Persons and Places, 1944, The Middle Span, 1945, and My Host the World, 1953. In addition to numerous other books and essays, Santayana's published correspondence to over 350 respondents runs to 8 volumes.
What was evolutionary thought like in America during the 19th century?
Within educated communities, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was broadly accepted as an accurate history of living beings. Since deism, or the idea that God was suffused throughout nature, was a widespread perspective at the time, there was not an obvious conflict between religious accounts of creation and evolution. Discussion more commonly centered on whether social forms of evolution were ruthlessly competitive or cooperative. As in 19th century European thought, there were two perspectives: life in society, as in nature, was read in tooth and claw and a matter of survival of the fittest. Or, life in society, as in nature, evolved through cooperation. It is not surprising that the transcendentalists favored the cooperative view.
What is the philosophy of biology?
Strictly speaking, philosophy of biology is not new because it has been part of philosophy since Aristotle, 384 to 322 B. CE. However, recent thought about how living systems are different from the inert subject matter of physics and chemistry have resulted in new philosophies of biology as a distinct theoretical/philosophical subject. Moreover, social controversies, such as popular debates about creationism and evolution, and beliefs in individual self-determination versus genetic determinism, have injected new vitality into older issues in philosophy of biology.
What is the connection between philosophy of mind and philosophy of language in analytic philosophy?
Their development has been intertwined since the end of the behaviorist explanation of language learning. The new field of cognitive science, which arose from Noam Chomsky's 1929 philosophical treatment of linguistics that disproved behaviorism, shows how philosophy of language is connected to philosophy of mind. When Chomsky proved that language learning required innate linguistic capacities, the whole tabula rasa or blank slate theory of mind came tumbling down.
What are Aristotle's 10 categories of existing things?
Aristotle posits 10 categories of existing things: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, doing, having, and being affected. Each of these terms was defined by Aristotle in pretty much the same way we would define it today. The one exception being substance. For Aristotle there were primary and secondary substances. A primary substance was a whole thing, such as a man or a dog. A secondary substance was a quality of that thing, such as rationality or loyalty. To take the rest in turn, quantity is the number of something, a mathematical amount or measure. Relation is a connection or comparison between things, such as above, below, before, or after. Place refers to where a physical thing is. Time is both the passage of events and a specific time on a clock or a calendar. Position refers to how something is oriented, for example, right side up or upside down. Doing refers to action, such as playing the harp or curing the sick. Having refers to both the possession of a thing other than the possessor, for example, your wallet, or to something that is happening to you. such as having a good time. Being affected refers to the effect of one thing on another. For example, you're being affected by heat when you put your hand in the flame of a candle. Aristotle's main unit of existence was primary substances. A primary substance is a specific thing, such as a cow in a field, a dog, or a tree outside the Lyceum. Secondary substances are the groups to which the primary substances belong, such as bovines, canines, or plants. Primary substances have accidents which are changing qualities that we would call attributes that can only exist in them, for example, tallness, fatness, furriness, or greenness. Our scientific knowledge is all about secondary substances, which have no real existence of their own but are abstractions in our mind based on the common nature of members of groups of similar primary substances.
What is ethical egoism?
Ethical egoism is the moral system that everyone ought to pursue his or her own self-interest above all other goals. As with ethical relativism, it has both a descriptive and prescriptive form. Descriptive ethical egoism holds that everyone always pursues their own self-interest. Prescriptive ethical egoism holds that everyone should always pursue his or her own self-interest. Insofar as she thought that communism and socialism were evil and widespread, Ayn Rand 1905 to 1982, was not a descriptive ethical egoist, although she was clearly a prescriptive ethical egoist.